Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our latest series of Grand Challenge lectures at the Institute for Liberal Arts and Sciences at Keele. Before I introduce our speaker this evening, we've asked Andy to say a little, Andy Zelnick, who's our leader for our liberal arts programme here at Keele, to say a few words to give you a bit of a background and flavour of what we're doing here at Keele in terms of liberal arts. So Andy, do you want to come and say a few words before we kick off this evening?
Hello and welcome. My name is Andy Zelnick. I'm Academic Lead and Programme Director for Liberal Arts at Keele. And over the last 2 years, I've been intimately involved with a small team of people in the design, marketing and recruitment of our liberal arts degree programmes. There's been many challenges and obstacles to getting these degrees validated, designed, organised, as well as trying to encourage students to apply through traditional and perhaps non-traditional means. But we are very optimistic that we will have our first cohort of students starting in September 2017. This is an exciting development for the institution, and it builds on a history of interdisciplinarity teaching and research that was at the heart of the origins of Keele some 50 odd years ago. The extension of liberal arts degrees within the UK higher education sector represents a commitment to the investing in new interdisciplinary programmes that reflect challenges in the world in which we live in today. It also reflects awareness and understanding that knowledge, abilities and a variety of essential transferable skills that liberal arts students will possess allows those entering the complex world of employment in the 21st century to be more than capable of succeeding and adapting to a changing workplace and living environment. We believe that liberal arts programmes, with their emphasis on interdisciplinary knowledge, help make students more informed to make career and personal decisions. This interdisciplinarity leads to excellent skills development, such as analytical, evaluative, critical, creative thinking, effective communication and information literacy skills, cross-cultural knowledge, problem solving, the ability to learn and synthesize new ideas from a range of disciplines and perspectives, to have experience in quantitative and qualitative methodological and data analysis, to the organisation, time management and team working skills that are necessary in the modern world. Students from liberal arts, we believe, will be adaptable, self-confident and also self-understanding, ability to be able to make ethical decisions. All of these are at the core of the liberal arts degrees that we have designed at Keele, and we know that these are valued by employers. However, we also believe that a liberal arts education will provide the best basis for a personal and intellectual growth and development so that students will become active and able global citizens. Now, I have been in discussion with colleagues at other UK higher education institutions who are involved in the provision of liberal arts through various conferences and networks. My understanding and my experience of this is that each institution, such as SOAS, King's, Durham, Sheffield, offer liberal arts programmes that reflect and build on their own institutional history, specialisms, excuse me, and vision. And that's what we are doing at Keele. We're building upon what we think is the strong history that we have of interdisciplinarity at Keele. I have found with these colleagues from various institutions involved in liberal arts that there is nothing less than a spirit of collegiality, not competition, and there's a shared commitment to making liberal arts a cornerstone of its provision in the future. So it gives me great pleasure in welcoming Carl to Keele and to ILAS tonight. His role as Programme Director of the Arts and Sciences BASc degree at UCL now has some 450 undergraduate students, and this puts him and UCL ahead of the curve of many of us. So I'm excited to hear about the insights and advice that such an experience provides, and that hopefully will be a benefit to all of us here who are involved directly in the liberal arts degree or who are interested in liberal arts, natural sciences, interdisciplinary degrees in their development, design and eventual delivery. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy, and can I just take this opportunity to thank you, Andy in particular, for the efforts that you've made and real personal efforts to get our vision off the ground in terms of liberal arts at Keele. I know you've worked very hard toward that. You mentioned that Carl Gombrich is Director of University College London's Arts and Sciences Bachelor of Arts and Sciences degree, which is a new degree. I gather it's being emulated by others at the moment. But Carl himself has degrees in a really staggering range of areas, including maths, physics and philosophy. As if that wasn't enough, Carl also studied and taught music and was a professional opera singer for a significant period of time, having trained at the National Opera Studio where he was a Royal Opera House scholar. Carl speaks, as many of you know, and publishes widely on themes related to interdisciplinarity and liberal arts and sciences, and is a member of the recent British Academy Working Group on Interdisciplinarity, which was constituted to look at interdisciplinarity in early academic careers. I know that's something you've got a particular passion for. His interests include the future work and notions of expertise in relation to education. On his blog, he notes that whilst currently he reads mostly on interdisciplinarity and the philosophy of education, he's interested in everything which touches education, for example, politics, economics, and in particular, artificial intelligence. And that's, again, a very, very topical matter of debate just at the moment. I think his interest in music is absolutely fascinating, particularly interest in the relationship between music and religion, and how that impacts on our worldview. Of course, many of you will know that Carl comes from a family with an illustrious intellectual academic family, and I think for many of us with that sort of pedigree, it would put a huge pressure on us either to rebel completely against that and do something else, go and be a rock star. In Carl's case, I think you became an opera singer in rebellion to that, but you've come back to the academic fold. Many of you will know that his paternal grandfather, Ernst Gombrich, was an art historian of one of the 20th century's leading intellectuals and thinkers. He wrote The Little History of the World. I have my own personal thanks to your grandfather for that. When I decided to take the family on holiday to the south of France, I assumed that the AA roadmap for the south of France, being the same size as the AA roadmap for the south of or for England, meant that it would take about the same length of time to drive down. And the day was only saved from complete rebellion from my family by a very insightful purchase by my wife of a CD box set of The Little History of the World by your grandfather. And whilst I was initially sceptical that this would keep the rebels at bay at the back of the car, in fact it kept them absolutely fascinated for the whole journey. And it was just enough time for drive from Calais through to the Mediterranean coast. So it's perfect, and I'd highly recommend it for anybody who's got to do that very, very long journey. Not only your grandfather came from a strong academic tradition, but your father, Richard Gombrich, was an Indologist and scholar of Sanskrit, Pali, and also Buddhist studies, and was Emeritus Professor of Sanskrit at Oxford University. And on your mother's side, your grandfather was American professor and political theorist who taught Kennedy and Kissinger. So a pretty staggering background to live up to. This brings me on to your talk tonight, which you've got a lot to live up to, looking at your CV, is on interpreting the liberal arts and sciences tradition. And Carl suggests, and I think we would agree and reflect on this here, that at a time when we face ever more questions, pressing questions about the value and purpose of education, the challenge for education in contemporary liberal arts and sciences courses is possibly greater than ever, and I think that's something we really would resonate with you here this evening. So without further ado, it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Carl Gombrich, our Grand Challenge lecturer this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those wonderful introductions. It is scary to hear my family spelled out in quite that way, but it's all true. So if you hear the clanging of names, I hope that will now have passed for the rest of the evening. I'd just like to thank Jonathan very much and Joe for inviting me here to Keele. As you all know, Keele is really one of the forerunners of the idea of a more interdisciplinary and eclectic education. So it's fantastic to see this coming back now. I'm going to speak for about 30, maybe 35 minutes, not too much longer, because I think in a forum like this we can learn a lot from talking to each other. I'm going to address some very big themes. One of the great things about becoming a sort of educationalist in midlife is that it gives you an excuse to talk about pretty much anything. As you heard about from Jonathan, I am interested in almost everything. I'm not very interested in golf, I'm afraid. So if there are any golfers in the house, and I know golf's quite big up here, where I'm staying is actually a golf course in a hotel, that might offend somebody. But just about everything else you can think of on the planet I am interested in. And education gives us a lovely opportunity to think in these very abstract and very general terms. And I think that's a very important thing to do at some times in one's life and in history indeed. But also I'll try and give some very concrete examples of things we're doing at UCL and some very concrete measures we can take to implement some of the grander concepts I hope I'm going to be able to introduce to you. So this lecture, I think, a bit like some of our core lectures at UCL, will have something for everyone, but not everything will suit everybody. And that's quite interesting, actually, when you implement core courses like we have at UCL Arts and Sciences. If you're going to talk about epistemologies of knowledge, you might have somebody who's very into engineering who just doesn't want to hear any of this. But we say you have to sit with us. At the end of it, you'll get something out of it. And if one part of the lecture doesn't appeal to you, or the lecture series doesn't appeal to you, another part will. And I hope that's also true today. And you're slightly older than my students, so I hope you'll sit with it, even when some of it is not perhaps of direct interest to you. So I've given myself this immensely modest title, right? But I think I'm really quite sincere about it, really, because I think education is everything in a sense. I mean, it's what drives nations, and nations meet each other economically, politically, sometimes belligerently. And so getting education right is, in a sense, I think the greatest challenge. So I'm quite serious about that. Jo pointed out to me that I've skipped arts and sciences on this slide. She's quite right. We'll come back to that in a moment. It is a talk about liberal arts and sciences, but in the tradition, of course, the Western tradition, it was called liberal arts until it went to America when sciences was added later. So it's about arts and sciences, but I will come back to the tradition at one point. So I'm going to break down this idea that this is the greatest challenge into three smaller challenges, each one still huge, but I hope that will give you some structure to my thinking about why this is the greatest challenge. Two of those challenges are, I think, positive and very exciting, and one is less so. So the positive and exciting things, and I'll go into these in a little bit more detail as we go through, are the global shifts in education and the interaction between countries and cultures. And the other one is something which Andy's already touched on, is the sort of merging of arts and sciences in an interdisciplinary context. It's not obvious, really, talking to mum and dad, that liberal arts and sciences and interdisciplinarity are really that closely connected. And indeed, when we started at UCL, the vision of my course, which I now have been so closely involved with for 7 years, was, on the one hand, liberal arts from Malcolm Grant, the then provost. On the other hand, rather radical interdisciplinarity from the then vice provost, Michael Wharton, who was into things like medical humanities. And they got on very well, these guys, but they really didn't share the same vision for what this was going to be, this program. But in fact, once you liberalize the curriculum and say, why not? Why not do psychology and law and find some connection? Why not do engineering, inorganic chemistry, and industrial design and find some synthesis? Then you get interdisciplinarity. So in a way, some kind of liberalizing of the curriculum is a necessary condition for interdisciplinarity, but I think we can really go big guns on this now. And part of that, this tonight, what I'm going to talk about is the world of work, and how this has become so important to employers, and how single disciplines are increasingly irrelevant to employers. So as a sub-theme of the merging of arts and sciences, I will be talking about employment and employability. But I want to talk firstly about the negative challenge, which is this idea of a closing of minds. Now, before I just get to this slide, not always, but certainly the last 200 years, and certainly through the American lens of liberal arts and sciences, there's been a kind of absolutely rock assumption that education, and particularly liberal education, should be about opening your mind. That's been taken to be a good thing, not something anybody would question. And so this is a typical quote from Don Randall, the ex-president of Chicago University, now chair of the National Academy of Sciences, that once openness to new ideas has been sealed off, once the imagination has atrophied, and once curiosity has shriveled, little hope remains for reversing the course toward the quality of mind we would like to cultivate. So in the back of that is saying we need to grab young people while they're young, open their minds, allow them to become creative, synthetic thinkers and researchers, and that's what liberal education should do. In a related but slightly different context, Karl Popper, in his great work on political science, talks about the difference between open societies where there's a constant kind of regeneration of possibilities and closed societies which are very prescriptive. And I think there's a very nice close analogy there between education systems which exist to foster openness in people and those which exist to hand down prescribed knowledge, whether that's religious knowledge or political knowledge. So part of certainly the most recent liberal tradition has been to open minds. That's what we should be doing. Right? But what if people don't want their minds open? What if this assumption is actually not something lots of people will go along with? Here is, I think, one of the most interesting correlations between in the recent Brexit vote. The correlation between what psychologists measure as open-mindedness and voting intentions. I'm not going to politicize this, it's not the point. There will be people in this room who voted Brexit, there are probably people who voted Trump. But it's very interesting, or like Trump, but it's very interesting that in terms of what academics think open-mindedness is, how they measure it, there seems to be a strong correlation between one's political views and that quality of open-mindedness. Now this, for me, is a massive challenge to liberal education and higher institution educations, because if a majority, however small, say we just don't have that base value, we don't want this open-mindedness, what do we in the academy do about it? I have no answers to this. That's why it's a great, great challenge. But I really think, in a sense, we are on the back foot with this already. The margins might be small, but we know what 1 or 2% means in national plebiscites. So this is a huge challenge for us to rethink what liberal education means in terms of a population. And you know, you can flip that around another way and say, are we really being diverse enough in having more conservatives and closed-minded people in our institutions? Is that even possible? Can we say, we like you, you're really closed-minded, come and study liberal arts with us? Because we actually like your closed-mindedness, not because we want to change you and make you open-minded, we actually value you as closed-minded. These are really, really difficult questions, but I think we have to address them, because I think we're slightly losing that battle at the moment. One of our core assumptions is being severely challenged by a very, very large number of people. Some of this you may know is Jonathan Haidt in America has talked about this, about American university campuses in particular, how undiverse they are because they don't have any conservative thinkers on them. Right? Diversity isn't just about having people who like more diversity, it's about having some people who don't like diversity. So Haidt's very interesting on that. I'm going to quote a tweet because I believe we should be much more eclectic in our academic referencing, the way we look around. So this is a nice tweet I follow, Meeta Sengupta, who's an educational consultant from India. I just thought that was a lovely quote recently. Curriculum is where politics is revealed. We have so many base assumptions about what is right that we do in our curriculum, but when the chips change or the chips go down or new chips go down, we really have to rethink these types of political questions. So that's my negative, but I think it's quite an interesting negative for people like us to think about. Now, this is slightly crazy, but I thought I really should try to give some kind of background to the liberal tradition so we can sort of understand broadly what we're talking about. This is the history of Western liberal education in one slide, and that's important because my next slide is going to be about global ideas of this sort of education. So some of you may know this stuff, others of you may not. it's a decent summary. So this idea of liberal education can be taken to have started with the Greeks. There's always been in this tradition an idea of kind of universality. It's an ambition. No one thinks you can know everything about everything, but the ambition is to know broad and wide, know as much as possible. And in that metaphor, you have circular with this idea of encompassing everything. Then the idea of disciplines is generally taken to have started with the Romans, with Cicero in particular, and his slightly older contemporary Varro with the 9 disciplines, which became the disciplines we then got to know as the liberal arts in medieval period and beyond. And these great medieval codifiers of that tradition handed down the works which then became the curriculum for Western universities. Boethius, some of you will know, added which now look more scientific quadrivium, the 4 disciplines, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, to the already existing grammar, rhetoric, and logic. And these, without too much exaggeration, became what Western universities taught for hundreds of years, arguably 800 years, from Bologna in 1088 through to the turn of the 19th century when things were reformed in France and Germany. Within that period, scholastics, Aquinas and so on, became very preoccupied with marrying Christianity with Aristotle. And I bring this up not just for the history lesson, but because I've talked about liberal education opening minds. I did mention it at the time, but it's worth repeating now. That's certainly not always been the case. I mean, you can't argue that when the Catholic Church was dominating Western universities, they were hell-bent on opening people's minds. So we have to be cautious about what liberal education really means, though I do think in the last 200 years, particularly the American influence, that idea of liberalizing has become much more important. Of course, and many of you may know that liberal originally meant education for a free person. The liberal was the emphasis that you could afford to do this education because you were rich enough. You weren't a slave who had to work for the living or do manual work. So the word liberal has actually changed its meaning in liberal education quite a lot over the centuries. Then we had the great revivals of humanism and science in particular, but science didn't really catch on in universities for a long time. So that in 1620, Francis Bacon, the great early philosopher of science and scientist, complained that in schools, academies, and colleges, everything is found adverse to the progress of science. For the studies of men in these places are imprisoned in the writing of certain authors. He was referring to Aristotle, too much Aristotle. And then 100 and something years later, Voltaire complained again that a university is an institution confined by scholasticism. So all the great revolutions in science, particularly driven by the Royal Society in London and the Academy in France, were not actually part of universities. And there were many incredible amateur societies and even things called dilettante societies, which I rather like, in dilettanti in Italy, where all the exciting science was going on. Although it's a little risque to even suggest this because it's become such a negative word, I quite like a revival of dilettantism. I think it'd be quite exciting. It's basically hacking, which is exciting. But that word has become appropriated to mean something kind of trivializing and too amateur. So, you know, when I try and do this quickly also to students, they don't want too much history, I say, you know, what are we missing out now at universities? Are we as eclectic as we think we are? Are there things going outside university that really we would benefit from bringing into the academy, just as the universities have to do in bringing science in and ignoring it for a very long time? And I think there are things that we should be thinking about. Then in the 19th century, we had the great revivals in France and Germany, particularly in Germany, where Bildung is a kind of European version of liberal arts. Bildung is connected to the word Bild, which means painting. The idea was somehow you painted your own education, which was particular to you. The French revival was a little bit different, and that brings us up to date with the debate about the two cultures in our society, which many of you will be familiar with, that there are essentially two cultures, the sciences and engineering and the non-sciences, and ne'er the twain, and they can't speak to each other. And this is sadly still quite true, I think, partly driven in this country by our incredibly narrow A-level system, which I think, wiser heads, more experienced people may know this, I think is the narrowest in the world. I think every other education system, you do at least 4 subjects, 16 to 18, most at least 5. And I've never heard an intellectual rationale for it. Never. No politician, no educationist, no one has told me why English, and it's English, not Scottish and Welsh, students are so special that they should only do 3 subjects from 16 to 18, and what good it's doing them. So we drive our students from the age of 16 into one of these boxes, and we wear ridiculously things like artists wear it as a badge of pride that they can't do any maths. I believe I'm right in saying that in China, to go to the best art schools, you have to have A-level maths. We wouldn't have anybody in our art schools in this country if that was the case. So this is something I'm very passionate about. Can't get any sense from many ministers about it. Why? Why do we require our 16-year, 18-year-olds only to do 3 subjects? It seems complete madness to me, but that's why we still have, I think, in many ways, the 2 cultures. Okay, that's my history lesson. And before we get to the 2 other challenges, which are part of my big challenge, there are very interesting debates. I think one of the lovely things about this topic actually is you can carve it up any way you like and make a great story out of it, and that's fine. That's what great humanists do. They pick an area to critique, they synthesize, they bring things together, and they tell a wonderful story. And throughout this history, there are lovely stories to tell about, for example, the battle between specialism and generalism. Up to about 1700, slightly earlier, everyone thought you should be a generalist. That's what learning was. That's what a scholar was. So Isaac Newton's predecessor at Cambridge, Isaac Barrow, said, "One cannot be a good scholar if you are not a general one, for one part of learning doth confer light upon another." Lovely, right? Then something happened. We got kind of too much knowledge. No one could do that. So we started getting specialisms. We started getting disciplines. We had the sciences with their publications and so on. But it's by no means, I think, a given, an essential, that specialism is what we should be aiming for at university. It's very hard to argue that one shouldn't be a specialist in something at some point in one's life. But why should it be driven by academic disciplines? I don't think there's a very good reason for that. Other interesting debates are about mind and body. This education has been typically associated with mind, which has actually led to some people thinking that engineering, which is much more about physical things and manual work, shouldn't be a part of it. I disagree wholeheartedly, particularly in the modern context, but it's a view. And the other one, which I'll go into in more detail when I talk about the world of work, is the contrast between education as a good in itself, something you shouldn't question too much, like friendship. You don't have friendship for a reason, or if you do, you're not a very good friend. Friendship's a good thing, or love is a good thing. So it has an inherent value, and other people who think the whole point of education is to produce an economic unit of some sort, either for yourself, so you can earn more money, or for society at large. And those are strongly contrasted. And I have to say, in the liberal arts tradition and in the community, people tend to emphasize this very strongly, that it's a good in itself and we shouldn't be looking for any instrumental purpose. I disagree with that. And I think quite excitingly, I think we can now marry these 2 things and make a case that these 2 things are now synthesizing in some way that perhaps I haven't done for a very long time. So to go back now to my challenges and the exciting ones, I've dealt with the negative but very interesting one about the closing of minds. It's one world now. Whether you like it or not, it's one world now. And I think it's tremendously exciting what's happening particularly in China and India, but all over the world. And I wish I had more time to do this, but with everything else it's tricky. I'm really, really interested in the developments in China in particular. I've been learning Mandarin for 4 years now. It started almost with a bet with a neuroscience colleague of mine, because we said we must keep learning with the students. Liberal arts is all about learning. We've got to show the students we never stop learning. So, of course, he started learning French, dropped out after a year, and I'm still learning Mandarin 4 years later, very, very slowly getting there. So, 中国特色人文与科学教育. Okay, the Chinese translation of liberal arts and sciences education. What does it mean to a Chinese person, Chinese scholar, to marry their tremendous tradition of Confucianism, there's Confucius, Kongzi, the Mandarin education, with the Western education, which they want. They're interested in it. They like things about our tradition. But what does it mean? Where's that going to go? And India, of course, that's from Rabindranath Tagore, who I don't know much about, but Martha Nussbaum in her books talks about him quite a lot, a very wonderful Bengali poet. What does it mean in India, in that incredibly rich culture? when they marry, sorry, that means liberal arts and science education with Chinese characteristics, I should say. That's the Chinese characteristics bit there. What does that mean when they marry our tradition with their great traditions? And it's happening. It's happening a lot and very fast. So we've got Yale University in Singapore with a wonderful course looking at philosophers, Confucius, Socrates, and forgive me, I forget the other one now, but someone from the Indian tradition. We've got, of course, New York University throughout China, Ashoka University, a new liberal arts university just outside Delhi, the famous Indian Institute of Technology, brilliant scientists they produce, are introducing humanities courses into their curriculum, like MIT do. Really, really interesting. Why? Not just doing it for the hell of it, they must think there's a point to this. What's that going to mean when they start bringing in critical traditions, Western critical traditions, to guys who just want to get their head down and do lots of Fourier transforms? I'm going to St. Stephen's College, Victorian College, part of the University of Delhi, in September to talk about interdisciplinarity in their curriculum. So these are incredibly big, yes, vague, it's still, yes, general ideas and concepts, but they're very exciting. I think this marrying of the cultures, our great tradition, their great tradition, some new version of liberal education is something enormously exciting which we should all be interested to get involved with. Now, the last of my challenges is this integration of the arts and the sciences. And this will lead me on to talk about work and the future of work. And I think it's immensely exciting at the moment what you can do. And I don't think it's that surprising what you can do actually either. Sorry, I keep standing in front of you. I was going to walk around, but there's not really a... This is very like the rooms I used to sing in when I was an opera singer, so I'm sort of tempted to go, sort of start singing and wander around like I did when I was doing Don Giovanni in the Commendatore. But it's harder to walk around. I'll try a little bit. We're living in a period where we have a literal, if you like, literally metaphorical, explosion of the combinatorial space of ideas. All around us, encoded in little electromagnetic waves, are billions and billions of ideas. And you literally pluck them out of the air, decode them, and mash them up any way you like. And this means that interested learners, of which there are many at Keele, at my university, and all over the world, don't see library categories anymore. They don't see disciplinary boundaries. Why should they? Those things were created from the social structures, the publication structures of their day. And therefore, it's not surprising that things like the two cultures just seems ridiculous, the brighter, younger students. Now, I'm going to tell you about a few examples of the sort of things our students have done because they're so exciting. But the challenge here is institutional. I put as much as epistemological, methodological. I think I should really have said more than epistemological, methodological. Disciplines, and we've all been there. We all get immersed in our discipline and see the world only that way while we're doing it. They just set up their own natural boundaries and find it very difficult to then break out and make those connections. They get proprietary about the knowledge and the way of doing things, and it gets very hard within an institution to break that down. That's a huge challenge you guys will have. I have its ongoing challenge, but I think it's artificial in a sense. So I just want to tell you about three or four of my students from who've graduated. They're all graduates, those now. So Lena last year won the World Undergraduate Award Prize for Environmental Science. She did a final year dissertation looking at the feasibility of anaerobic digestion at halls of residence, where they would take waste food, put it in this little machine, mash it up, heat the building with the waste food. So no more just chucking away your baked beans and banana skins, actually it's kind of circular economy. And she was particularly looking at getting rid of the effluent from that because it creates a nasty kind of residue which you have to get rid of. What disciplines did she bring to bear on that? Environmental engineering, environmental economics, sociology, and law. Perfect. What I love about this example, there are many though, is that it gives a lie to the idea that this sort of means a little bit of this and a little bit of that. By that synthesis, she became, at a very young age, kind of a world expert in the feasibility of small-scale anaerobic digestion. What an amazing synthesis. And once you say it, it's something your grandmother gets straight away. Go, oh yeah, of course, yeah, okay, so you need these disciplines to put them together. without being in that position, you might say, well, what are you doing combining environmental economics, sociology, law, and engineering? But the project, the task, brings these things together, and that's what many of your kind of lectures about grand challenges show. I'll just mention another one that's not on there, but Amy was interested in global child mental health. What does it mean to diagnose a child with mental health in different cultures and different societies? We all know in America it's very largely driven by drug companies. There are more and more diseases you can have because you can treat them that way. If you go to parts of Africa and you say these diseases to people, they think you're crazy. That's not a disease, it's just being a child. So she studied to do that. She studied psychology, anthropology, immunology, sociology, all sorts of things, all to bringing to bear on children. And a lovely synthesis, and she's now working for a think tank. Christina studied neuroscience and literature and wrote a dissertation on neuroscience and the poetry of T.S. Eliot. She's actually gone on to be a lawyer. We'll talk about that kind of thing in a minute. But again, the importance of applying psychology, and particularly neuroscience, to almost everything now, from gaming to law to literature, is just manifest. What are we doing here when we do those kinds of things? You need both sides of the coin to really understand it. So, and finally, this was one of my supervisees. I'll mention them both. They're both interesting. Oliver did a dissertation on alleviating poverty in developing nations, and looked at it through economic, anthropological, and sociological perspectives, and looked at the sort of neoclassical view of how you alleviate poverty versus the anthropological view, and a really fascinating interdisciplinary critique of what it meant to alleviate poverty and how one might go about it. And Zora lastly is a slightly different example, but this is a practical example for people implementing syllabi. She studied inorganic chemistry, and she got the top marks at UCL, higher than any BSc single honours chemist in inorganic chemistry in her final year. A full course unit, so a quarter of her final year was organic chemistry. She got over 90% in that, and she was offered to go straight onto a PhD in organic chemistry. Zora also studied at the same time management accounting and Arabic, and she didn't want to be an academic, so she got a very nice job in the city as an actuary. But I didn't think that was possible when I set up this degree. I got a background in physics. I thought you need a lot of physics to get a physics degree. Turns out physics maybe you do need a bit more, but chemistry really does split into 3 bits: inorganic, physical, and organic. We have people now doing inorganic chemistry doing really well, just in that strand, which leaves you a whole lot of time to do other really interesting things if you want to. And Zora's, great job now, over 40,000 a year, I think, background in organic chemistry and other things. So tremendous opportunities to liberalize the curriculum in both ways that are very contemporary in a synthetic sense. Perhaps Lena and Oliver's examples are the best there, also Christina to some extent, and also just a why not sense, because you can do very well and then go on and do another job. Now, I'm running, I didn't keep an eye on when I started actually. I'm okay. So all these areas are areas which require, I think, fundamentally some kind of interdisciplinary curriculum for the student to have studied. Digital humanities, neuroscience I mentioned already. Got lots of students now interested in neuroscience and film, actually, very interestingly. Both from the artistic side, how can they make more powerful or interesting or affecting films using the knowledge they know in neuroscience, and from the neuroscience side, what's going on in our brain when we look at films. Data visualization, we do quite a lot of that on our program. Sustainability, digital health, these kinds of things, which everyone more or less knows now exist, are all interdisciplinary. And I think it's best, I know this is kind of risky, but I think it's best that we set up some structures and some frameworks and some core courses. I'm not going to talk about them today, but perhaps in the Q&A we can talk about them, which give the students the tools, some tools and some confidence to get on with it, but then we let them get on with these syntheses more or less on their own. We do have a capstone dissertation on my program which requires them to show interdisciplinary working, to bring things together in some synthetic way. So they get nervous, what am I going to do? When they sit down, they realize, like Lena, they've done engineering and law and they can bring it together. They really get into it. So it's a bit scary initially, but in the longer run they can do it. But I think it's best we don't, what I'm trying to say here is we don't discipline these too much early on. Right now, we don't really want whole degrees in data visualization, whole degrees in sustainability. I know they're kind of happening, but I'm a bit skeptical about that. The whole point of this combinatorial explosion of ideas that I've talked about is that it's a great, great era for creativity now. The potential is untold. And if we start to discipline this too much, we lose the whole point of that in terms of the student experience, in terms of what they can learn and what they can come out with. So I'm coming towards the last third to quarter of the talk now. So just to remind you that these two philosophical terms really are that inherent is something that's good in itself, education as an end in itself, developing of the mind of the person. This tends to appeal to traditionalists and those that had the privilege of being able to afford such education, in the sense of having time or money. And the instrumental argument is as a means to something else. The modern roots, I think, are in democratic accountability. Why should the state pay for this? What's it getting out of it? That's a very instrumental phrase, but now part of the so-called neoliberalist agenda. And I think this is quite a nice way to gloss this, that in micro terms it means you educate yourself to get a job rather than because it's a good. And in macro terms it means that in some ways education as an object in society is serving society in some way. Now I think, and I wrote about this on my blog, which all sorts of interesting stories spin out from all these things. By the way, I didn't mention my suit when I talk about China. If you're interested in suits, this costs 120 handmade in China. Get a ticket over to China for 600 quid, buy 10 suits, save yourself 5 grand. Sorry, I just thought I'd throw that in, because it's the first time I've worn it. My wife's quite happy I'm wearing it tonight. Where was I? I can't remember where I was now. I got sidetracked. I just wanted to tell you that story. So, yeah, these two, yes, that's right. Yes, so I wrote a blog about this, the kind of the end of the dichotomy, if you like. That got picked up. The story here is that academic careers, I think, are becoming slightly less traditional now as well, though that might be hard to see when we're all audited all the time. My blog was picked up by someone who invited me to a conference in Shanghai. I wrote a paper, then got published. That's led to lots of spin-outs, including leading a big national debate on the future of work. Amazing thing. So just blogging about something a bit quirky and interesting led to very interesting connections, and I think we should encourage our students to blog much, much more and link their work to hashtags and to other academics. So I think these things are coming together now, and this is why. This is the sort of home run in the talk. This is a slide from the recent Association of Graduate Recruiters, which many of you will know is the umbrella body that looks after people who are employing our graduates. Right? These are the guys who get the stats and the data on what's happening to graduates in the world of work. This is from last year, a survey of 194 employers. That's a good sample. And this is very, very interesting. What this says is that 82% of graduate employers do not give a monkey's what discipline you studied. 82% and upwards, going up. The trajectory was 77, 78, 82, in the thousands it was 63%. Something's going on in the world of work which has nothing to do with academic disciplines. 194 employers, lots of students. Something's going on out there in real work where people are saying, I don't care whether you've got a biomedical degree, a history degree, even a French degree or a computer science degree. That's a very big number, 82%. If the trajectory is right and Britain isn't sent back to the dark ages, that will keep going up. There are other interesting stats on here as well, but that's the headline news for me. The 2-1 value is going down, the 2-2 value going up. Perhaps not so surprising given the changing nature of work. This was odd to me though, work experience going down. Can't explain that. But this is really the headline news. 82% of graduate jobs are degree agnostic. They're not interested in the discipline you study. When I talk to students, they all get very excited straight away. I mean, school students, and say, oh great, we don't have to go to university. That's not the message. You definitely still need to go to university. You have to learn all sorts of cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary, soft, i.e. hard, skills like getting people in a team to do something for you, but the discipline doesn't count. With regard to soft skills, there's a nice anecdote from David Doherty, the chair of the Council for Industry and Higher Education, who has a PhD in philosophy on Heidegger, and he said, I don't know why they call it soft. I can tell you getting a PhD in Heidegger was a hell of a lot more interesting, a hell of a lot more difficult, more hard than getting my team to do what I like. Right? That is a hard skill. compared to a PhD on Heidegger. But those are the things which you will need to do, and you can really get them best by studying at university. So let's think about why this is. What is happening to the world of work? Sorry, that's probably a bit indistinct from the back of the hall, but it's just the top thing I want you to look at. Manufacturing in 1841 was 36%, it's now 9%. This is 2011, it's gone down a bit since then. And the big one, 33% services in 1841, it's actually 83% services now in this country. Again, I'm talking as if we're on some kind of trajectory. I still think, despite the Brexits and Trumps of this world, we're not going to bring back mining and large-scale manufacturing. I've just been in China, right? No way are we going to compete with those guys. Not going to happen. That's the tragedy of all this, is that we haven't managed to value what we do so well, which is services. We haven't managed to say, we do this great, let's believe in it, let's invest in it. We have a romantic idea, if we bring back factories and some kind of manufacturing sector, it's all going to be all right. It's just not going to happen. I think many of you believe that, some of you maybe don't, but just travel around the 2.5 billion people in the Far East and ask yourself if any businessman would really set up a large-scale manufacturing outfit here. I spoke to a nice delegation from Japan who said to me exactly that. They said, you guys are so good at services, you're so good at management, you're never going to compete with us for the technical things. It's over, it's past. Why don't you do more of this services thing? Why don't you get it? This is what you do so well. Didn't know what to say. So, this is the story. And so, what are services? Services are soft skills, they cross lots of boundaries, they cross lots of sectors. These are the sorts of job titles which your students will go and do. You may not like them, but this is reality, and we have to come to terms with reality. Two of them are made up, one of them is real. Anyone want to guess which the real one is? You guessed that one's real, thank you for your contribution. Any other guesses on what's real? They're all very close to real things, but one of them is an actual job title.
I hope the third one is real.
You hope it's real? Good. Any others? Your hope is answered. It was a national travel company, wanted a head of transparency. Lovely. I'm transparent. Look through me. Something to do with social media, I think, and accountability. The others are very close. They're actually sort of amalgams of existing jobs, but they're not actually taken from a web page. What disciplines do these require? Have a guess. I mean, seriously, it's not just a rhetorical question, kind of trying to wind you up with these silly jobs. I mean, they obviously require all sorts of different things, right? I mean, the health one has a health aspect, but you're going to have health with digital. And you have to have lots of soft skills that go with that. Head of transparency, you probably need some kind of business, some kind of social media, possibly marketing. And because of this fluidity, this fuzziness in the workplace, there's a lot of people talking about the end of job titles. In my lovely job, I have such amazing opportunity to meet such interesting different people that I would never have done before. I went to meet Cass Hussain, who's the head of BT Connected Homes, the Internet Things part of BT. They all sit at little tables, head of HR, the newest employee on the block, the guy testing the widgets, banging them with a hammer. They all sit around little plectrum-shaped tables, and everyone's doing everything. The guy with the hammer saying, can you test this? It's got a Portuguese label, I can't read that you're Portuguese. Oh, I'll translate that for you. The HR person saying, have you got an email from this person who wants to work for us? Just shows it to Joe from accounts. Yeah, I think that's quite interesting. They're all doing everything. So why would you have a job title that's going to restrict you to just do that one thing? Google taught like this as well. There's a lot of churn, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of excitement. That's all good. But it means you've got to manage this transition from narrow, siloed disciplines to something very different. So I think this gives us an amazing opportunity to link what we do in an instrumental way to the world of work, while still valuing the inherent value of education, because it's exciting. I mean, the students I told you about aren't complaining that it's instrumental. They're saying, this is great, I'm doing something which I enjoy, which is good and interesting, but it has an instrumental output as well. So those two things can become much closer together than they perhaps were during the 20th century and before. Business thinkers like John Hagel here of Deloitte, Marty Neuermeyer heads up a design agency, talk much more about these sorts of qualities of people than their knowledge. I know we're all a bit skeptical about that. I'm a bit skeptical too, because I don't think it's just about qualities. You have to know to code a bit if you want to be in some kind of computer business, and certainly if you want to be an engineer, you've got to know some stuff. But the idea is that there's so much change and creative, generative possibility in businesses that you can plonk someone in, and if they've got these qualities and some kind of background, they'll pick it up quick enough and do it very quickly. If, on the other hand, they've got none of those qualities and 3 degrees in electronic engineering, they're going to be dead within 6 months. They're not going to be able to work and go with the firm as quickly as the firm needs to go. So these sorts of qualities like sense-making, emotional intelligence are things that John Hagel talks about. And they're also, I think, in a light-hearted but actually quite a serious way. I read Cicero when I wrote this piece, and he talks about education as connected with freedom. And John Hagel now is talking about work as connected with freedom. Not obvious when you're working with Assos warehouse down the road, I know. But for our sort of graduate jobs, where work is going to be much more self-directed over the next few years, there is a coming together of the idea of freedom and work through these softer ideas of creativity, sense-making, emotional intelligence, and so on. But it's nothing to do with the discipline. So all these sorts of jobs require some crossover, some interdisciplinary synthesis, or at least some eclectic background. I'm only going to tell one story from this slide. We have a student who's got a great training contract where they pay you to train in a legal company with Norton Rose Fulbright. She did a little bit of law with us, but she was mostly working on smart tech in cities through the Internet of Things. And she was at a networking event and they were talking about their clients, and the client was a big council. It might even have been Lee's council, somewhere up here, but it was a big council. And they said, we've got these clients, we don't know what they're talking about. They've got all this data, they want to analyze some of the privacy issues, some of the, the marketing issues of this data and so on. We know nothing about it. My student said, oh, I know about that, I've done that. They're like, fantastic. So we need, the law companies say, people who understand our clients' business. All the black letter law stuff of years of classicists and historians from Oxford going off and doing law now, those guys, and I met them at a conference, they're all doing 6-month courses in biotechnology now when they join the law company. And that's a big ask when you've done classics for 3 or 4 years. But if you come the other way and you've done some science, some genetics, some tech, data visualization, you're not really scared of it. You know how it works, you can read the papers, understand what it's about. The law comes like, thank you very much. We can teach you the law, read this, learn these statutes, see these cases, go and talk to our clients, because that's what they want to hear about. So we see many people going into law, and the law companies love them because they've got this balance of the science and some background in law, enough to know that it's what they want to do. So let's sum up then. I think it's very hard, really, and you've probably picked that up, that I've not really given a positive definition of what liberal arts is, or arts and sciences, because it's so many things, and particularly historically it's changed a lot, and I think now with this global challenge it's going to change again. I think you can give a negative definition that it's not specific training in a narrow discipline for one job, or specific technical training. That's great too, but as I've already pointed out, with 83% of jobs in services, and 82% employers not particularly interested in that type of training, that will remain a niche in this country unless we really go back to the 1930s in some funny way. So liberal arts, I think, is easier to define in that arts and sciences in that slightly negative way. It has a natural breadth, a natural universalizing tendency to want to be comprehensive, and a natural eclecticism. But it's still challenging to keep that open-mindedness and that breadth while we go through these huge periods of change. And I think one of the reasons we know, I think people voted Brexit and Trump, is the fear of change. There's a lot of change around, and it's very frightening. I understand that. We all understand that. But to keep that open-minded, to keep that valuing of eclecticism and universality is a great challenge when there's change going on, because people tend to shut down. The response is to retrench. So just to remind you, I divided this challenge into 3 sub-challenges. One was the closing of minds, which I think is a tremendous challenge for higher education institutions. Much more positively, I think we should all be looking outward to the great cultures of the East, which are reviving and in 20 years will overtake us economically. And what's exciting is they want us, they're interested in us, so we should go towards them and work with them to think about how this education develops with them. And lastly, I mostly spoke about the crossing the arts sciences divide, which is, I think, much less scary than people think. There are so many real world problems, real grand challenges, that simply require this, that we can provide the frameworks and the curricula to facilitate students to do really interesting things in these areas, and that will lead them on also to very interesting work afterwards. My final comment is, I think if we get scared, if people in this room get scared, there's really no hope. We will just be sending our country, our students, our institutions back decades. And I'm passionate about the value of universities. I think they are the hubs and the engines of civilization in many ways, whatever's happened to them throughout history. And they're so resilient too. Of all the institutions over the hundreds of years, universities, I think, are one of the most resilient of all. But we need to keep them in the center of our society so that they are socially relevant and have this function of generating the best that they can for our societies and for the students within them. So thank you. I've lost track of time completely, but I hope we have time for some questions. Thank you very much.